She still remembered the exact morning he disappeared, not because it was dramatic or loud, but because of how ordinary it felt. The way life sometimes breaks you quietly without warning. As she stood in the kitchen holding a cold cup of coffee, staring at a note that explained nothing and yet somehow explained everything. And for years afterward, people told her to move on, to be strong, to stop asking questions that would never be answered. But what they never understood was that the hardest part was not losing him. It was losing the version of herself who believed she was worth staying for. And as time passed, she built a life that looked stable from the outside. A job, routines, responsibilities, even moments of laughter. Yet beneath it all lived an unanswered silence that shaped every decision she made, every relationship she kept at arm's length. And now, decades later, when she least expected it and no longer needed closure to survive, a single piece of information surfaced that cracked open the past, not violently, but slowly, like light entering a room she had kept locked for years. And as she stood there absorbing what this new truth meant, she realized that whatever she was about to learn would not change who she had become, but it might finally explain why the wound had taken so long to stop aching. And for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to feel something she had avoided for decades. Not hope, not anger, but a calm readiness to face whatever the past still wanted to say. For a long time, she did nothing with the information, letting it sit quietly in her mind the way unresolved memories often do, revisiting her only late at night when the world slowed down and distractions no longer worked. And she began to replay moments she had buried for years, small details she once dismissed as meaningless, but now felt heavy with implication. The way he avoided certain conversations, the tension in his voice when money was mentioned, the sudden distance that appeared weeks before he vanished. And as she connected these fragments, she understood that his disappearance had not been an impulsive act of cruelty, but something far more complicated and far more painful to accept, because it suggested fear, pressure, and choices made under weight she never knew existed. And while this realization did not excuse the silence he left behind, it softened the sharpest edge of her anger, replacing it with a deeper, quieter grief for two lives altered by decisions neither of them fully controlled. And as she sat with that truth, she felt an unfamiliar shift inside herself, realizing that for years she had carried the story as a personal rejection, when, in reality, it may have been a collapse he was too weak to survive openly. And this understanding did not bring relief, but it brought context. And context, she was beginning to learn, could be just as powerful as forgiveness when it came to finally loosening the grip of the past. The next morning, she woke up with the strange feeling that something irreversible had already happened, even though nothing in her external life had changed. The house was quiet, the routine intact, yet internally a line had been crossed, because once certain truths surface, they cannot be pushed back into the dark. And as she moved through the day, she noticed how her thoughts kept drifting backward, not just to him, but to the version of herself she had been before everything fractured, the woman who trusted without hesitation, who believed that silence always had an explanation and absence could be temporary. And this comparison unsettled her more than the discovery itself, because she realized how much of her life afterward had been shaped by that unanswered loss, the cautious ways she loved, the distance she kept even from people who cared deeply, the instinct to prepare for abandonment before it could surprise her again. And standing alone in her kitchen, she felt an unexpected wave of grief, not only for the relationship that ended without closure, but for the years she spent blaming herself for a disappearance that was never hers to solve. And as that grief settled, it was followed by a quiet but steady resolve, a realization that the past no longer deserved to dictate the limits of her present, because whether he had left out of fear, shame, or desperation, the life she built afterward was real, earned, and resilient. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to acknowledge that surviving unanswered questions had made her stronger, not broken. And that strength, though born from pain, now belonged entirely to her. Later that evening, as the light outside softened and the day slowed into something quieter, she found herself sitting alone with thoughts she had avoided for years, not because they were painful, but because they were unfinished. And it struck her how much of her life had been lived in reaction rather than intention. Every major decision subtly influenced by the fear of sudden loss, the belief that stability was temporary and love could disappear without warning. And this realization felt heavier than anger or sadness because it meant acknowledging how deeply that one unresolved chapter had shaped her identity. And as she reflected, she understood that closure was never about receiving an explanation from him. It was about reclaiming authorship over her own story, about deciding that the unanswered past would no longer hold veto power over her future. And in that stillness, she allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by what vanished, but by what remained. Her resilience, her capacity to rebuild, her ability to love even after betrayal and silence. And while the memory of him still existed, it no longer felt central, more like a distant echo than a living presence. And for the first time, she sensed a shift from survival to intention, a quiet readiness to move forward not because the past had been resolved, but because she had finally resolved herself, choosing growth over waiting, clarity over longing, and peace over the endless search for explanations that would never fully arrive. The following days unfolded differently. Not in dramatic ways that others could notice, but through subtle internal shifts that only she could feel. Moments where old habits tried to resurface and she consciously chose another response, realizing how often she had minimized her own needs to keep emotional balance in relationships that were never fully secure. And this awareness brought both discomfort and strength, because it forced her to confront the truth that waiting had once felt safer than deciding, and yet it had quietly cost her years of emotional presence. And as she moved through ordinary routines, work, conversations, small silences, she noticed how her thoughts no longer revolved around hypothetical reunions or imagined explanations, but instead around boundaries she had never allowed herself to set, standards she had once feared would push people away. And this shift felt unfamiliar yet grounding, like learning to stand on solid ground after years of adjusting to unstable footing. And she understood that healing was not about erasing the past or pretending it no longer mattered, but about integrating it without letting it dominate her choices. And with each deliberate decision, she felt a growing confidence that her future would not be shaped by abandonment or uncertainty, but by clarity, self-respect, and the quiet strength that comes from choosing oneself without resentment, without drama, simply with calm conviction. As time passed, she began to notice something unexpected. Not a sudden happiness, but a steadiness that no longer depended on external reassurance. A sense of emotional balance that felt earned rather than borrowed. And in moments where she once would have questioned herself or replayed old conversations searching for hidden meanings, there was now a quiet acceptance of what had been and what would never be explained. And this acceptance did not feel like defeat, but like release, because she understood that clarity does not always arrive through answers, but through the decision to stop asking questions that keep you emotionally tethered to the past. And as she reflected on the years she had spent waiting for consistency from others, she recognized how deeply she had internalized the belief that patience was the same as loyalty, when in reality it had often been fear disguised as hope. And this realization did not fill her with anger, but with compassion for the version of herself who had done the best she could with the emotional tools she had at the time. And now, standing in a different emotional space, she felt capable of choosing relationships that felt mutual rather than uncertain, grounded rather than consuming. And for the first time in a long while, the future no longer felt like something she needed to brace herself for, but something she could meet with calm confidence and self-trust. As the weeks unfolded, she began to understand that healing was not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual recalibration of how she related to her own thoughts. Because the silence that once felt heavy now felt intentional, and the loneliness she feared no longer defined her sense of worth. And in the quiet moments where memories still surfaced without warning, she no longer fought them or tried to rewrite their meaning. Instead, she allowed them to exist as evidence of a life fully lived rather than a series of mistakes to be erased. And this shift did not come from forgetting what had happened, but from finally seeing the full picture without idealization or self-blame. Realizing that love offered inconsistently trains the heart to confuse intensity with depth. And as she reflected on how much emotional energy she had invested in maintaining fragile connections, she recognized that true intimacy does not require constant self-sacrifice or emotional vigilance. And this awareness slowly reshaped how she showed up in the world, less apologetic, less eager to prove her value, more grounded in the understanding that being chosen should never feel like a negotiation. And as she moved forward, she no longer measured her progress by the absence of pain, but by the presence of clarity, knowing that while the past would always be a part of her story, it no longer had the power to dictate the direction of her future. And that realization, quiet and steady, became the foundation on which she began to build a life defined not by what she endured, but by what she consciously chose next. Over time, she noticed that her reactions were changing in subtle but important ways, because situations that once triggered anxiety or the need to explain herself now passed without urgency, and conversations that previously drained her energy no longer felt necessary to sustain. And this was not because she had become cold or detached, but because she had learned to recognize when her presence was being valued and when it was merely being tolerated. And this distinction brought an unexpected sense of calm, as if her nervous system was finally learning a language it had never been taught before. And she realized that much of her past exhaustion came from trying to be understood by people who were never listening with the intent to understand, only to respond or to defend their own version of events. And as this awareness settled in, she became more selective with her time, her words, and her emotional availability, choosing spaces where reciprocity existed rather than chasing validation where it was absent. And while moments of doubt still appeared, they no longer controlled her decisions because she trusted herself now to walk away without needing closure or permission, understanding that peace is often found not in resolution, but in refusal, the refusal to keep participating in patterns that quietly erode self-respect. And with that mindset, she continued forward, not rushing toward happiness, but moving steadily toward a life that felt internally aligned, where her sense of stability came from within, rather than from the unpredictable behavior of others. As weeks turned into months, she began to understand how deeply her past habits had shaped the way she navigated relationships. Because for years she had measured closeness by intensity rather than consistency, mistaking emotional highs and lows for connection. And it took time to recognize that real safety often feels quiet, almost unfamiliar, like a steady presence that does not demand constant proof or sacrifice. And this realization forced her to confront how often she had ignored early signs of discomfort just to preserve a sense of belonging, telling herself that endurance was the same as loyalty. And as she reflected on these patterns, she noticed how her body responded differently now, no longer tightening at certain words or anticipating disappointment before it arrived. And instead of bracing herself, she allowed pauses to exist, allowing people to reveal who they were through actions rather than explanations. And while the shift felt empowering, it was not without grief, because letting go of old roles meant acknowledging how much of herself she had given away in the hope of being chosen. Yet within that grief, there was also relief, a growing confidence that she no longer needed to overextend to earn respect. And with each boundary she upheld, she felt a quiet strengthening, as if she was rebuilding something internal that had once been worn thin by compromise. And although uncertainty about the future remained, she trusted that whatever came next would be met with clarity rather than fear, knowing now that her worth was not something to be negotiated. In the end, the change was not marked by a dramatic moment or a clear victory, but by something far quieter. A calm recognition that she no longer felt the need to revisit old wounds for validation or closure, because the lessons had already settled into her bones, guiding her choices without effort. And as she looked back, she could see how much energy she had once spent trying to be understood by people who were never listening, mistaking persistence for love and self-denial for strength. And now, as she moved forward, she did so without bitterness, carrying neither blame nor resentment, only a grounded awareness of who she was and what she would no longer accept. And while life remained uncertain and imperfect, it no longer felt threatening because she trusted herself to respond rather than react, to walk away rather than endure, and to choose peace even when it meant choosing solitude. And in that quiet confidence, she found something she had been seeking for years. Not happiness as a constant state, but stability within herself, the kind that does not depend on who stays or who leaves. And as she stepped into the next chapter, she understood that this was not an ending shaped by loss, but one defined by self-respect. And that realization, steady and unshakable, was enough.